Hello, General Drawing. Our next project is experimental icons. The purpose of this project is to get you to think about material experimentation. And to do that, we're going to use an icon of one kind or another. And so this slideshow is about introducing a few definitions of both the icon and experimentation. So we're going to start with the icons. So the word icon comes from a devotional painting of Christ or another holy figure, typically executed on wood and used ceremonially in Byzantine and other Eastern churches. So the word icon comes from this religious context, but of course the word icon has come to mean other things. Here's an example of religious icons, a diptych of the Virgin and Child enthroned and the crucifixion from 1275 to 1280, somewhere in that date range. So this is a kind of traditional icon painting. So that's, like I said, that's where the word comes from, and it's one definition of the icon, and it's an idea about the icon that I'm happy for you to work with if you're interested in taking this project in that direction. The next idea about the icon that you may want to think about, work with in this project, is the icon as a person or thing regarded as a representative symbol or as worthy of veneration. Now, this is an example of an artist working with one of those people, one of those iconic people. Marilyn Monroe is the person, Andy Warhol is the artist, and this is another diptych. So maybe there's a connection there to the iconography that we looked at previously, the icon painting in the religious context, and the diptych that we saw there. So this is Marilyn diptych from 1962. It's acrylic on canvas, and clearly some printmaking techniques used here. So the third idea about the icon is a symbol or graphic representation on a screen of a program, option, or window. So these are some iconic icons, I guess, designed by Susan Kare. Some of the icons that are still in current use in a whole lot of programs that we use up until this day, including the floppy disk icon as the save icon, and the print icon is another one that you see in current use. Susan Kare, a very famous designer and famous for designing these icons. And in linguistics, an icon is a sign which has a characteristic in common with the thing that it signifies. So an icon, and just this is a little bit of an aside, but it's worth just thinking about. An icon has a physical resemblance to the signified, to the thing being represented. And I guess this speaks to pictographic alphabets, where the icon is the pictogram. So, and it might resemble the thing that is being signified. So, the icon that represents the tree resembles the tree, perhaps, in a pictographic alphabet. So you can go from icon to index to symbol. So the icon has a strong resemblance to the thing being signified, like the tree representing an icon of a tree representing the tree. The index is something about the thing that is being used to indicate the thing. So the smoke is something that happens when you have fire, and the smoke is used to indicate the fire. A symbol has no resemblance between the signifier and the signified. The connection between them must be culturally learned. So these is numbers and non-pictographic alphabets. So there's some, you can see how there is an overlap between the icon in linguistics and how we might think about graphical icons and other kinds of icons. But particularly graphical icons, because graphical icons are related to pictographic scripts. So again, the graphical icons. This is the most important thing in this whole project. Icons are recognizable. Religious icons, cultural icons, or computer icons all share this trait. Recognition also makes images iconic. So you, as part of this project, you may decide you want to work with an iconic image. That image should be recognizable to everyone else in the class, regardless of their age. Now, that's a little bit of, there's a little bit of wiggle room there, perhaps, in terms of how you interpret an icon, because there's definitely things that are specific to generations, that images that are maybe iconic for your generation may not be as iconic for other generations. But it is important that your icon is recognizable, because we're going to be playing around with that dimension in this project. Okay, so that's an introduction to icon. This is an introduction to experimentation, to some ideas about experimentation that are maybe not immediately obvious to you. So yeah, some ideas about experimentation that I want to explore in this project. We have been experimenting with all of our projects so far, but this project introduces some specific ideas about experimentation. So, as a noun, an experiment is a scientific procedure undertaken to make a discovery or test a hypothesis, or demonstrate a known fact. Now, I've kind of crossed that out, but I'm not 100% about crossing out demonstrate a known fact. But certainly we can think about how this scientific definition of the experiment applies to art making. We experiment to discover things in art making. We also experiment to find out if an idea that we had about how certain materials might respond, if that idea actually corresponds to what happens when we use those materials. So that's a kind of way of testing a hypothesis. And sometimes we might also experiment to just be sure that what someone else is telling us about how certain materials works is actually the way that they work. So that's maybe where we might experiment to demonstrate a known fact. But certainly when we talk about the experimental in art, we're thinking more about the first two definitions. And we're certainly thinking about the definition that is numbered, number 2 on this slide, that is a course of action adopted without being sure of the outcome. That's really the key definition, I think, on this slide, is that an experiment is a course of action that is adopted without being sure of the outcome. So that's the spirit that I want you to embrace with this project, is that you can do things, you can engage with materials without being sure of how it's going to work out. And that's what we have to do to expand our material horizons, right? Because once we come to know materials, then we have a pretty good idea about how they're going to respond in different situations. But when we pick up new materials, we often have to engage with them without being sure about how it's going to turn out. And that engagement with uncertainty is really important in experimentation. That experimentation is a way of using what we know to engage with the unknown. And that's an idea that I'll come back to in the next slide. So as a verb, to experiment is to try out ideas or methods. To try out ideas or methods. And the trying out bit is really important there. The ideas and methods is also really important. You have an idea about how an artwork might turn out. You have to experiment to see if that idea is true. Did it turn out the way you thought it was going to turn out? You have to experiment with methods, with processes to figure out how they work and to figure out how you might use them in your practice. So experimenting is to try out ideas or methods. And this is the way that my colleague in the drawing department, Marg Roberts, describes experimentation, is that you do something, you look at the results, and based on what you see, you decide what to do next. And that's another idea about experimentation. That's the idea that experimentation is an iterative process. You do it and you repeat it. Perhaps you might repeat the same experiment to see if it is going to produce the same results. Often in the messy world of materiality, it will produce slightly different results, right? So, but then you're looking at what the results that are produced and you're deciding what to do next. Your decision might be to repeat exactly the same experiment and just explore the variation that comes from repeating the same course of actions, right? Your decision about what to do next might be to tweak your experiment a little bit so that you can push it in a certain direction. And in that way, our experiments can become more focused over time as we tweak them as we go along. So here's some more ideas about experimentation. As I said, experimentation is a method for exploring the unknown through means that can be clearly defined. Or to say that another way, experimentation is how we use what we know and can clearly define to explore the unknown. And this is an idea about experimentation that I was alluding to in the previous slide, which is that experimentation is not simply getting loose and throwing things around, throwing paint around. It's about defining methods and defining parameters of perhaps how loose you might get, but it's about defining things in order to explore the unknown. And often those experiments become quite controlled. And in fact, all of the examples of artists that I discuss in this slide presentation are artists who are working in very controlled ways with their experiments. And you'll see the kinds of results that produces. So the other important dimension of this project is that experimentation in art has a personal dimension that is less important in science. In science, it's often the case that scientists are working on problems that they all agree on, that a group of scientists at least agrees are important to explore through experimentation. Individual artists have a bit more freedom, I think, than a scientist might in terms of defining for themselves what their experiments are and what the criteria for judging those experiments might be. Right? That's the important thing, and that's the personal dimension, I think, is that you get to decide what the criteria is for judging your own experiments. And I think it's important. Having said that, I think it is important to make those decisions, to decide, okay, what I'm going to do some experimenting. How am I going to judge these experiments? So that's something for you to think about in this project, how you judge your experiments. So these are some questions that are rhetorical questions that I'm going to answer for you. What is the difference between experiments that test a hypothesis and the kind that make discoveries? Well, there are experiments where you have an idea in mind and you want to see if that idea might be true when you bring it into a material form. There's also a way of experimenting which is more akin to curiosity-driven research, right? Which is something that they talk about in science, and I think it equally applies to art. That is, you allow your curiosity to follow an unfolding process. And in that way, you can make discoveries that you maybe could never predict before you actually started doing the experiments. So it's a bit more open-ended than the kind of experiments that might test a hypothesis. And I think that's a useful thing to think about in art, how you might have these curiosity-driven dimensions to your experiments. And it's always great, I think, anyway, in terms of my own practice, I think it's always great when the results of your experiments surprise you. And in order for them to surprise you, then and that's when you're really making discoveries, is when the results of your experiments surprise you. I think that's a good indication that you're discovering something new, at least for yourself. It may not be something new to art in general, but it's something new for you yourself in your own practice. How can we structure artistic experiments? I'm going to talk more about this in relation to the artists that I discuss. I think the question of structuring an experiment in art is really important for you to think about. It's important. It's an important general consideration, is how we structure our artistic experiments, and they can be more or less constrained. You might have very controlled, highly controlled experiments, and I've got examples of that coming up, and you might have other kinds of experiments that are a bit more open and loose. So what is the relationship between experimentation in art and science? Well, I've already talked a little bit about this, but I think what I said previously about the personal dimension of experimentation in art is very important. There's also a distinction to make here between the way that we report the results of our experiments in both art and science. So in art, we report the results of our experiments by showing our work to other people, whether that's in an exhibition context or in class. That's our way of reporting our findings of our experimentation. In science, there is this emphasis on publishing those findings in peer-reviewed journals, and I guess the equivalent of that in art is having a public exhibition. It's where you put your findings out into the public sphere. But putting your results into a peer-reviewed journal, that's a very specific way of formatting your experiment that scientists have to engage with. We have more liberty as artists to determine how we're going to report the findings of our experiments by putting on an exhibition. And I think it's important that we take advantage of that liberty that we have in showing an experimental process in space. Why is experimentation important? Well, it's certainly part of the discipline. It's a big part of the discipline. It's something that artists have done throughout history, and there are institutional practices around experimentation that are, as I said, part of the discipline. So there is, if you're applying for grants at the Australia Council, there is you might apply to the visual arts section of the Australia Council, but you might also apply to the emerging and experimental arts section of the Australia Council. And so you can see within a funding organisation like the Australia Council, there is a specific section that you can apply to that has to do with experimental practices, emerging and experimental practices. So we, as a culture, we value experimentation, and that's reflected in the institutions that are part of that culture, including here at NAS. And that's why it's important for me to have a project that addresses experimentation directly in this way. So let's get on to some examples of experimental work and talk about how that work is experimental. This is Solowit proposal for a wall drawing from the Information Show at MoMA in 1970. The Information Show at MoMA is a kind of really important milestone in conceptual art practice. It's the first big institutional show of conceptual art. It's when conceptual art becomes part of art institutions. Up until that point, it was a fairly marginal practice, and here is where it becomes really important. And conceptual art, we can think about a relationship that may not appear obvious to you immediately between conceptual art practice and experimental art practice. And I think this work by Solowit really demonstrates that relationship. So the proposal for a wall drawing from the Information Show, here let's just read through this text. Within 4 adjacent squares, each 4 by 4 inches, 4 draftsmen will be employed at $4 an hour for 4 hours a day and for 4 days to draw straight lines 4 inches long using 4 coloured pencils, 9H black, red, yellow and blue. Each draftsman will use the same colour throughout the 4-day period, working on a different square each day. So here are some instructions for making a work. These are the instructions that Sol LeWitt asked here the 4 draftsperson people to follow, and we could have a go at following these instructions. I mean, I think that could be a fun thing to do. But what you'll see is that what you might imagine from those instructions, they're a kind of abstract set of instructions, and what you might imagine from them could turn out to be quite different from what actually happens when you follow these instructions. And that really, therein lies the experimental aspect of this work, is that you can write something in the abstract, as Sol LeWitt often did for his wall drawing projects. You can write a set of instructions in the abstract, but it's only when you actually make the work that you realize what it is actually doing. So you have to make it in order to see what it does, and that is the experimental aspect of I think all of Sol LeWitt's instructional work for wall drawings, is that we only really see how they work, what they do, when we make the drawing, and so that's a way of exactly what I referred to previously, that experimentation is a way of working with what we know and can clearly define in order to explore the unknown, right? So Sol LeWitt's instructions are very clear. They're very clearly defined, but they are also a way of exploring the unknown. So this is the installation view of a work that was here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and so this work was at the Art Gallery of New South Wales last year. This is a reflection by one of the installers, and I guess the only thing I want to take from this, I'm not going to read this slide out to you, but the only thing that I want to take from this is that for the installers, they had to figure out how to make this work, right? They had to figure out how they could follow the instructions that LeWitt gave. The instructions don't tell the installers exactly how to do everything, right? So there's a degree of experimentation and figuring out that the installers had to do. So in order to create these wavy lines, the installers had to use these pieces of conduit, and then and 3 people had to be holding them. So you had 2 people holding the conduit and a 3rd person tracing the lines that make up this work. And so ultimately the work has to be made materially by bodies in space, and that is a significant part of the experimental aspect of this type of work as well, is figuring out how to do that. The instructions are fairly clearly defined, but there's still a lot to figure out in terms of how bodies in space can make the work. The next artist I want to show you is Sean O'Donnell. Sean O'Connell. Sean is a friend of mine, so I should get his name right. And he says about these works that he's made that these experiments involve various materials and objects which are bombarded with high voltage electricity directly over photographic film in a darkroom using bespoke high voltage generators. So we can just click on this and open up Sean's website, and we'll just see a few more of these works. So basically, Sean is a jeweler. So some of the works that he's done along these lines, including this image that we saw on the slides, are of rings that he's made as part of his jewellery practice that he's bombarded with high voltage electricity. You can see a whole variety of other materials here. You can download this catalogue, which is kind of a really comprehensive exploration of different materials and how they respond to that process of blasting them with high voltage electricity. And so, yeah, he's used this technique with a whole range of materials, and some of which are in that ring format, a bunch of that you can see here, and some of which are things other than rings, small pieces of other materials that he's placing on the large format film that he uses to do that. So again, an example of an artist who's using very controlled processes to create these works that produce all of this variation, and he's tweaking the frequency of the high voltage electricity. He's tweaking a bunch of parameters in order to get interesting patterns emerging from the materials that he places on the high voltage on the film. Because some materials need certain frequencies in order to produce sparks or to produce a pattern at all, or differing amounts of voltage and so on. So there's a whole set of parameters that Sean is working with there. And that's kind of what I mean in terms of things that you can define, things that you can clearly define. In this case, those elements of the amount of electricity, the frequency of the electricity. These are things these are numbers that you can define in order to explore the unknown. And the unknown for Sean was how these materials would respond when he blasted them with electricity. He had no idea what the exact patterns would be that would come off the materials and be registered in the photographic film. So that's Sean O'Connell. Ha Chong-kyun is a Korean artist. He has made this series of paintings that use a technique where he pushes the oil paint from the back of the canvas through the canvas, actually this is hemp cloth, not canvas. And that's important. The material conjunction is what he's interested in. And it's a material conjunction between not just the paint and the hemp cloth that he uses, but also his body is part of that material conjunction. So these are large works. It's important to look at the scale there. This is 162 by 130 centimeters. And 194 by 296 centimeters, really big works, bodily scale works, and like a really strong material dimension and very controlled material experiments, but a really strong material dimension where we can really see and appreciate what is going on materially, to the extent like that you have this haloing here at the top of where the paint goes through, where the linseed oil that carries the paint is spilling out and producing this haloing effect. So we get a strong appreciation for what is going on material in these works. Here's another one of the conjunction works, hemp oil. And here is a little description. So Ha Chong-kyun came to prominence with his conjunction series in the early 1970s. These early experiments have led him to build a signature style, pushing the paint from the back to the front of hemp cloth. As a leading member of the movement known as, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that, or bad pronunciation. As a leading member of the movement known as like monochrome painting, roughly translated, he has consistently used material experimentation and innovative studio processes to define the role of painting, playing a significant role in bridging the avant-garde traditions of East and West. And we've got a little video here. I will show you a little bit of this. Let's just hit play. I just want to show you, like, I'll send you out the link to this, and I really encourage you to look at this. But I just want to show you a few points along the way here that once it goes past the. So yeah, this is just to show you some images of Ha Chong-kyun working in his studio. You can see this process of pushing the paint through. He also uses he uses this process of creating a kind of a soot layer that he also pushes through with the paint. So he's using but here we can appreciate the scale of these works, and some nice close-ups as well of the texture of the works. The narration on this video, which we're not hearing, describes more about Ha Chong-kyun's process, and is really worth delving into and having a listen to. I just want to skip through a little bit so you can see again the scale of the works, and you can appreciate a little bit their materiality, and the way they really emphasize the material qualities of the paint and the hemp cloth that he uses. I think that's really important to recognize this as a thread within contemporary art practice, which is really all about the materials. In this project, we're thinking about the icon in relation to materiality, but there's certainly many examples of artists whose entire focus is on materiality and an appreciation of the materiality. And I think Ha Chong-kyun is an artist that creates these works that really encourage us to appreciate the depth that can exist when we really look at the material qualities of the work. So yeah, worth having a look at that video. I will pause on that here and come back to the slides. So just a few more artists. One is Stephanie Horton, whose work you can see in Building 11. If you go to the top floor of Building 11 and walk along that top floor, you'll find her studio and you'll be able to see these works in person. These images I've had to tweak a little bit in Photoshop so that you can actually see them, because they're incredibly subtle works. These are watercolor on paper, and you can see this work is 152 by 100 centimeters. The detail, here's a detail of the work. These are very subtle works that Stephanie creates by masking off sections of the watercolor paper and creating these grids. Really beautiful works. And once again, an idea about experimentation where the experiments are very controlled. These are highly controlled experiments. She's trying to get the most even application of the watercolor pigment to the paper as possible, and that involves a great deal of control, both in terms of how she masks the sections of the work, but also in terms of how she applies the watercolor to the paper. Anyone who's done work with watercolor will know that it's not a trivial thing to get this very even application of watercolor pigment to paper. So again, a very controlled experiment, and part of the experimentation is in the proportions of the grid. You can see this is a work where the horizontal grid lines get smaller as it goes towards the top. Stephanie's current work is looking at using the wavelengths of light, variations in the wavelengths of light, to determine the spacing of that grid. So she's thinking about how she can take the mathematics of vision, if you like, of thinking about the visible spectrum of light and apply it to creating a pattern in the grid. And again, those are very controlled experiments in terms of the measurements that are required, the precision of the measurements, and also then what comes out of it. And I'm supervising Stephanie's DFA project, and a lot of the conversations that we have are around what these works are doing perceptually. So we will sit there in front of the work and chat about how it's affecting our perception. What is it doing in space? So that's the experimental aspect of the work. She has to make the work in order for us to be able to have that conversation and start to think about, how the works are affecting us, and then what might come next. What's the next step in that process of material experimentation? So very much along the lines of what I said earlier about experimentation as an iterative process where you do something, you look at the results, and based on what you see, you decide what to do next. That's what Stephanie is doing with this whole series of works that has now been going through her MFA, which she completed the year before last, and into her DFA now. Yeah, beautiful work from Stephanie. This is the breakdown of the project. So you basically, these are the instructions, and it's quite prescriptive, but I think there's a good deal of openness as well, particularly around the materials that you want to choose to experiment with, and the subject. The subject has to be an icon, but you get to choose what icon that is. So these are the instructions. Choose an icon or iconic image / artwork. And of course, there are many iconic artworks that we probably all know, or we should now know. I mean, particularly if we're dealing with art historical works, you've now had over a semester in art history, so there will be a bunch of images that you've seen in art history that maybe you might want to work with. So I'm asking you to choose an icon or an iconic image or artwork, and it has to be recognizable. If it's not recognizable to most people, it's not an icon. Don't overthink it. The important thing is to start experimenting. So these are the stages of the project. You experiment with the icon. The first step is material experiments. Like, we're focused on materiality, and the whole project is focused on materiality, but we start with materiality. We start with material experiments. So I'm asking you to remake your icon in many different materials. Experiment with what you use to make marks, how you apply your materials, and what you draw on. Experiment with wet and dry media and using non-traditional materials. You might also work with collage or photographic processes. That could be a good thing to do, is like remake your icon in collage, chop up different pieces of images to remake your icon. That will certainly transform how we perceive the icon and how we think about it. These initial material experiments should all be the same size so that you can focus on how your material approaches changes the icon, right? So we're going to make a series of material experiments that are all at the same scale. In week 2, we experiment with recognition. At what point do we no longer recognize the icon? And you saw this in some of the sections of the Andy Warhol diptych where Marilyn becomes less recognizable. You can see here there's one where, maybe if we just saw that in isolation, we wouldn't recognize that as Marilyn. In this context, clearly we do, because we've got all these other images that are clearly Marilyn Monroe. So we're going to play around with the degree to which your icon is recognizable. That's week 2 of this project. So you can experiment with different ways of making the icon less recognizable by removing information. You might draw only part of the icon. You might blur its lines. You might distort its forms. You might manipulate it digitally, pixelate it, add noise, etc. I want to encourage you in that second stage of this project to try and find a threshold where the icon is only just recognizable. So play around with that. So when you cross over to the point at where it becomes unrecognizable, then you cross back again and make it only just recognizable. And perhaps you're jumping back and forth over that line of how recognizable your icon is. In week 3 of this project, we experiment with scale, and so this is building. So we're building on the previous material, the previous 2 weeks of material experimentation that we've done, and you can select one of those sets of materials or methods that you've developed in weeks 1 and 2 to make a really big version of your icon. Okay, that's the important thing to do in week 3. And this, when I say really big, it has to be at least as big as you. right? Because something happens when we make things at bodily scale. And I talked about this with Ha-Chung Yung's work, that, you know, the importance of scale in that work. I think scale is really important. Things transform when they become bodily scale. So you have to make one work that is at least your scale. It could be bigger than that. And the optional part of week 3 is to make some very small works too. But you definitely have to make a big one. In week 4, we will build on the works that you created in the first 3 weeks. So it's an opportunity to explore something that may have come up in those first 3 weeks. It may mean continuing to play with scale. It may mean continuing to play with recognition. It may mean continuing to explore materially in other ways. So that is the outline for this project. 2 more artworks to finish up with. One is another take on Marilyn from Australian artist Julie Rapp. This is window dresser number 1, Marilyn, and she's remixing this iconic image of Marilyn standing over the subway vent, where her dress is blowing up in much the same way that you can see Julie's rather futuristic looking dress blowing up. This image was done in Photoshop, so so you can kind of see that texture of the dress is not an actual dress. Anyway, that's kind of beside the point. The important point here is that this is the relationship of this project to certain techniques that have come out of postmodern ideas about art practice, like of remix and appropriation, where we take existing images and we transform them in some way that speaks to that original image, but also maybe transforms its meaning in one way or another. Julie Rapp has certainly done a lot of work in thinking about, her own body in her practice. She had some work in the Dobell Prize this year, where you saw her basically she was in frame rolling around and making a charcoal drawing. So she's definitely thought a lot about that relationship of how she works with her body as one of her materials, and this work is also influenced by Cindy Sherman's film stills, which have been hugely influential as well for many artists. And finally, Andre Serrano Immersion, Piss Christ from 1987. This has been quite a controversial work. Not so much among artists, but certainly non-artists and particularly people from the Catholic Church have taken offense to this. Andre Serrano is a Catholic, or was raised a Catholic at least. And so he's reflecting on his own relationship to religious iconography through this work. And I think that's an important thing to realize about this work, that it's a reflection on his own relationship to his own upbringing. He's not just trying to offend people with this work, but he's certainly calling into question religious iconography and thinking about his own relationship to that iconography through this work. So that's it for the presentation. Hopefully that is useful in inspiring you, getting you to think about what you might do with this project.